This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, January the 16th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. As that great quarterback Peyton Manning used to say, it's time for an Omaha. The podcast today was scheduled to be an interview with a gentleman named Phil, who's been on the podcast before. And Phil is he's a businessman. He's a respected businessman in the area, but he's also an outdoorsman and a hunter. And he goes deep into the uninhabited woods of southeast Missouri to hunt. And he stumbled across Bigfoot more than once. In fact, he recently did again, sent me pictures. He was scheduled to be on the podcast today, but like I said, he's a self-employed businessman, and a customer called and business called, and so he canceled at the last minute. Sorry about that. We tentatively have a podcast planned for the middle of next week, so hopefully in 4 or 5 days we'll have this podcast of the recent Bigfoot sighting of Phil back on. And he canceled at the last minute. He apologized 17 times, but I said, look, I'm not paying you for this interview, and your client is paying you, so let me think. You got a guy who's going to pay you for your work on Saturday, or a guy who's not going to pay you for your work on a Saturday. I lost, and I understand. So again, middle of next week, tentatively, we'll have Phil and his latest Bigfoot sightings on the podcast. Today, based on what's going on in this very funny world of ours, the pandemic, the economy, the up and the down, all the civil unrest that we've had, both in our inner cities and most recently at the nation's capital, I thought it was time to do a Professor Strong's recipe for success. And I do this about once a year or so, and it's been at least a year since I've done it. And basically what this does is it points out all of the first world problems that we have. Anybody listening to my voice, well, I would say the vast majority of those listening to the sound of my voice, you live in the United States, or you at least live in the Western world. I understand I have listeners in India. God bless you. And I thank you for listening. Maybe this applies to you. Maybe it doesn't. I'd love your emails if it doesn't, or if it does. But the bottom line is, if you were born in the United States, you've got life by the tail. You really do. And Professor Strong's recipe for success shows the 6 things that anybody can do. And if you do these 6 things, and none of them are hard, folks, none of them are hard. They're all so easy. If you do these 6 things, you, my friend, will not only be just fine, you'll be very good. With a capital V. So we got a couple things to touch on first, and then we will go right into Professor Strong's recipe for success. By the way, and I always make this recommendation before I do this podcast. I would strongly recommend that any of you older folks out there, and by older, I'm talking parents who have children, I'd strongly recommend that you have the children listen to this podcast. There'll be no foul language. Don't worry about it. I purposely eliminate any language, bad language from this podcast when I do this, because I think it's very important that children listen to this podcast. Because if you listen to the 6 recipes for success, Professor Strong's 6 lessons for recipes for success, and you're 50 years old, that ship may have sailed, okay? If you're 15, not so much. If you're 10, not so much. If you're 18, not so much, okay? You're young enough where you haven't had an opportunity to fail yet, okay? So, again, Professor Strong's recipes for success after my headlines in the news and updates, okay? Number 1, I want to give you an update on the Jaguar that my father and I are restoring with the help of others, too. 1951 Jaguar Mark 7. We worked on it last weekend, and we came upon a realization, something that, I assumed this was going to happen, but not on the scope that it has. But anytime you work on an old car, especially a car that's 70 years old, you run into frozen bolts, okay? And we've run into a lot of frozen bolts. By frozen, I mean rusted, Okay, they've been in place for 71 years, 70 years anyway. When you try to take them out for the first time in 70 years, things happen. Things break. You have problems. So we've hit an impasse. That's okay, though. That's part of the deal. That's part of the process. What we're doing right now is we're planning on disassembling the car down to the body, okay? Then we give it to a guy. He's going to rebuild the engine, rebuild the transmission, and sandblast it, prime it, seal it, and give it back to us. We then reassemble everything, give it back to him again, and then he paints it. So step number one is disassemble everything. And that means disassemble, document, photos, etc. Because if you take something off and then a year later you go to put it back on, I don't know about you, but my memory's not that good. So this is a slow process. Certainly it's not a sprint or a jog or maybe even a walk. Perhaps it's just a crawl. But slowly but surely we're making progress on the car, and I'll give you updates as they happen. Working on the car again this weekend. Don't know how much we'll get done because of the weather. Yeah, we're inside. Yeah, I've got a heater kind of in the shop. But it's cold. It's ugly. It's slick. So we'll get some work done. Don't know how much. On a brighter note, Major League Baseball made an announcement this week. And I say maybe you're a baseball fan, maybe you're not. But here's the good thing about Major League Baseball. When they start talking baseball, that means spring is just around the corner, okay? The Players Association and the owners have both agreed that we will play 162 games this year. Spring training will start on time. The season may not start on time. The season may start a little bit later, which is fine. I think the owners would like perhaps the season to start later because the later the season starts, the more chance there is of having fans in the seats, and fans in the seats mean they make more money, okay? Baseball, unlike many other sports, like football, the fans are almost a rounding error, okay? It's all about television. Whereas baseball, especially in the smaller markets like St. Louis, fans in the stands is a big part of the profit, a big part of the money. If you draw over 3 million people a year in the seats, and you go from drawing 3 million to drawing 0, that is going to put a dent in your profit margin, okay? So no fans means a whole lot less money. Now, I had a guest on the show who is really plugged into Major League sports and college sports for that matter, Kyle Harris. And Kyle told me on the podcast that the Cardinals lost $200 million last year. Now, I know what he said, and I don't doubt him. But I wonder if that means, did they lose $200 million? In other words, the balance sheet have $200 million in red on it? Or did they lose $200 million in revenue last year? Big difference, okay? A $200 million loss and a $200 million reduction in revenue are two different things. Don't know what it is. The owners are private companies, so they don't disclose their financial statements, nor do they have to. But between the owners wanting as much money as they can and the players wanting as much money as they can, it's a big money grab. And that's what sports have turned into. It's been that way for quite some time. Now, the caveat to that is it hasn't ruined sports at all. In fact, in many ways, it's made it a bit more interesting for some. The big caveat now is gambling in sports. So much so that Fox Sports Midwest, the station that if you're going to watch the Cardinals on television, that's the station you have to subscribe to. Gambling casinos are now part owners of Fox Sports Midwest. In fact, they're going to change the name to Bally's something or another or something like that. I don't the name. That's not the name, but it's going to be something similar to that. Okay. But if you think about it, gambling is a big part of sports nowadays. In fact, when they talk about the football games, they talk about the over and the under. Friends, I've never been a fan of gambling. I'm not against gambling. Don't get me wrong. But it doesn't interest me. It doesn't trip my trigger. I don't get excitement over gambling. Now, if you want to play the lottery a few bucks a week, that's fine. You want to go to the casino on a Saturday night and play blackjack or play the slots or play the roulette wheel or whatever you want to do, that's fine too. Now, if you walk into there thinking, I'm going to double my money and make the rent payment up that I lost last week, well, you're a fool. If you go for entertainment and if you win some money, that's a bonus, good for you. But gambling in sports, gambling has become a big deal in sports. And it's just a matter of time, in my opinion, that it's going to ruin sports. And I'm going to tell you why. As soon as, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When a left fielder drops a ball and causes a game to be lost. When a pitcher who throws a 98-mile-an-hour fastball hangs a changeup in somebody's eyes and somebody hits a home run and loses the game. When a manager pulls his good pitcher, puts in a bad pitcher, and he blows the game. And then that player, that pitcher, that outfielder, that manager is linked to a sports bet deal. Sports will turn into the WWE. It'll be all fixed. It'll be all show. And people will leave in droves. Why do I say this? Because it happened once before. Shoeless Joe Jackson and the Chicago White Sox, they called them the Black Sox, threw the World Series. And they threw the World Series to win a gambling bet. That ruined baseball. And baseball didn't come back until a guy named George Herman Ruth started playing and started hitting tons of home runs. It took somebody like Babe Ruth to bring baseball back. Because when you consider the guy, Frank Home Run Baker used to lead the league in home runs. That's why they call him Frank Home Run Baker. Why? I think one year he hit 8. Then Babe Ruth came in and hit 50 and 60. Okay. That's how Babe Ruth changed baseball. So if they ruin baseball again, or football, or basketball, or hockey, or any other sport, if they ruin it by gambling on the sport and fixing the games and turning it into the WWE, wrestling that is, it may never come back. Because, friends, there are umpteen bajillion different things to do with your leisure time. And if somebody wants to watch a fixed game that's there for entertainment only, they will watch the WWE, not the MLB, not the NFL, not the NBA, not the NHL. I hope it doesn't go that way, but it surely could. Okay, in the news, and I'm going to lead into Professor Strong's Recipe for Success. The storming of the Bastille last week was a low point for the country. Now, again, when I talk about this, the knotheads who stormed the Capitol building in an attempt to get into the House chambers, I'm not talking about the protesters, the peaceful protesters outside. That was their right, and that was fine. And if you look at all the protesters who protested outside of Washington, D.C., and compared those numbers to the knotheads who stormed the Bastille, as I like to say, they were the minority by far. So I'm not talking about the peaceful protesters. I'm talking about the ones who stormed the Capitol building. Something that I don't know if they even considered. They were not going to win. This was not going to turn out well. It could not have turned out good. There's no way this was going to turn out good. Did they really think they were going to storm the House chambers, get in, and then everyone in the country was going to say, oh, wow, we never considered that. Yep, you're right, Trump is president. That was never going to happen. Never. Never. It couldn't have turned out good. Now, there are going to be lots of repercussions, lots of them, and that's good. These people who stormed the Capitol building, and we have pictures of them, okay? They're going to be picked up. They're going to be arrested. They're going to be tried. Many of them are going to be convicted and go to jail, okay? So what's going to happen with these people is they're going to get prison time, real prison time for doing what they did. And they'll cry like babies when they're sentenced. At the very least, if they're picked up and they're tried, they're going to have to empty their 401k